Okay, good afternoon. Thank you everyone for attending. So today I will be presenting a lecture entitled Poems of Life, an introduction to the style and piano sonatas of Samuil Feinberg. Samuil Feinberg was a distinguished and original figure of the Russian Silver Age. A pianist, pedagogue, and composer, Feinberg is frequently recognized for his ecstatic and romantic style of pianism, as well as being a prominent interpreter of Scriabin and Bach. He also was an esteemed and dedicated teacher at the Moscow Conservatory. Similar to his contemporary Heinrich Neuhaus, Feinberg authored a treatise on the art of piano playing titled Pianism as Art. Regrettably, Feinberg's writings remain largely unknown outside of Russia, a circumstance also true of his compositions. Feinberg's compositions, primarily written for solo piano and his own performance, exhibit a distinctive voice that is largely unconstrained by the conventions of the early 20th century. This is particularly evident in his 12 piano sonatas. Many have regarded Feinberg as a successor to the style of Scriabin, as he followed a similar developmental path from Romanticism to a more experimental and complex sound, grounded in extra musical ideals. Subsequently, in the later stages of his life, Feinberg will shift away from extreme complexities and explore simplicity and lyricism as a means of expression. Unlike his contemporaries, who in the later 1930s began to distance themselves from the innovative and experimental music of the previous decade, Feinberg maintains the same imaginative voice, complexity, and originality of his earlier years, now conveyed in a more subdued and restrained manner. Tatiana Nikolaeva, in an article reflecting on the life of Samuil Feinberg, writes that a precept of Feinberg's was his sense of creative mission, his perception of the world, and each, for example, Feinberg's piano sonatas are special, bringing something new. It's a great pity that they are still so rarely heard on stage. Each of them is like a poem of life, brightly temperamental, pianistically rediscovered. This lecture recital aims to explore the evolution of a composer through his piano sonatas and introduce compelling and underrepresented music to a broader audience. By examining one sonata from each of his three stylistic periods, complemented by Feinberg's interviews, writings, and reflections from his contemporaries, we aspire to provide a more comprehensive understanding of his distinctive compositional approach. This will also help provide useful information to better understand and engage listeners and interpreters of these unique works. Feinberg's early years. Samuil Feinberg was born May 26 in 1890 in Odessa, a port city in what was then the Russian Empire in current-day Ukraine. In 1894, his family relocated to Moscow, where he would live until he died in 1962. The Feinberg family was not particularly musical, his father a lawyer, and the family valued education in the arts. His brother, Leonin, would later become a well-known figure in the art scene. At 6 years old, Samuil was discovered to have perfect pitch and started to teach himself to play piano by ear. He would begin more formal studies at 10 with his older sister's piano teacher, Sofia Spramova. Young Feinberg quickly outgrew her, recounting, they assigned me a Beethoven sonatina in G major, but by mistake, I bought the easy sonata in G, opus 49. That was a big step forward. He would then move to study with A.F. Jensen shortly after. Jensen would provide Feinberg with a systematic diet of the classics, Mozart, Beethoven, and Haydn, and would encourage the development of Feinberg's burgeoning skills of improvisation and composition. He would compose his first piece, a nocturne, which he would not write down despite his father's wishes. In 1905, Feinberg would begin studying under his final teacher, Alexander Goldenweiser, at the Philharmonia's music school. These studies were interrupted by the upheaval of the 1905 Revolution, a widespread, tumultuous political movement demanding social and political reforms across Russia. Following the turmoil, Feinberg would follow Goldenweiser to the Moscow Conservatory to continue his musical education in 1906. Feinberg's conservatory years were quite successful, as he was one of Goldenweiser's star pupils. Goldenweiser, like Jensen, would place an emphasis on the classics in Feinberg's early years of study, but would also introduce him to the compositions of contemporary Russian composers such as Rachmaninoff, Scriabin, and Medtner. Furthermore, Goldenweiser encouraged Feinberg's composing, encouraging him to move beyond improvisation and develop a more structured and formal compositional approach. Feinberg would be the first pianist in Russia to present all 48 preludes and fugues of the Well-Tempered Clavier for his final examinations at the conservatory. Despite his notable successes at the conservatory, he was still a quite nervous and shy student. His lifelong friend and fellow composer, Anatoly Alexandrov, would describe Feinberg's playing in his conservatory years as nervous and at times almost incomprehensible. In addition to his studies in piano performance at the Moscow Conservatory, Feinberg pursued private composition lessons under the tutelage of musicologist, composer, and critic Nikolai Giliev, was extensively engaged in the more progressive musical circles of the late 19th century and early 20th century Russia. Not only did he serve as an educator at the Moscow Conservatory, but he was a close friend and editor for Alexander Scriabin. Under his teacher, Feinberg was introduced not only to the music of contemporary Russian composers, but also to that of other progressive composers of the era, notably Debussy. Giliev's friendship with Scriabin also afforded Feinberg the opportunity to meet the famed composer in 1913. Scriabin commended Feinberg's interpretation of his Fourth Sonata, a rare compliment from the composer. After Feinberg's conservatory years, Giliev would also serve as Feinberg's editor until he fell victim to the political purges of the Great Terror and was executed in 1938. Feinberg's professional career as a concert pianist commenced after he graduated from the Moscow Conservatory in 1911. He subsequently performed throughout Europe, showcasing contemporary Russian and Soviet compositions, including his own works in countries such as Germany and Italy. Notably, he helped popularize Prokofiev's Third Piano Concerto in Germany, and was selected to premiere his own Sonata No. 6 in a new music festival in Italy. However, his international concert activities became significantly more restricted in the 1930s and thereafter due to the policies enacted by the Soviet government and his own challenges with being censored by the Stalinist regime in the 1940s. Feinberg joined the faculty at the Moscow Conservatory in 1922, becoming the head of the piano department in 1936. He would teach a number of successful pianists as well as present concerts of Russian contemporary composers, the complete Well-Tempered Clavier, and all 32 Beethoven sonatas throughout his tenure. Samuil Feinberg began publishing his compositions in the early 1920s. Alongside composers like Prokofiev and Miaskovsky, Feinberg was a member of the Association for Contemporary Music, the ACM. The ACM was the avant-garde and Western-leaning counterpoint to the Russian Association of Proletarian Musicians, RAPM, which was more closely aligned with the push by the Stalinist regime towards composing music that had mass appeal and included popular folk tunes. Feinberg's association with the ACM gave him opportunities to premiere his own works and the works of his contemporaries, but it also would be a factor in him being labeled a formalist in the 1940s. Despite his political troubles, Feinberg would win the Stalin Prize in 1946 for his successful but conservative Second Piano Concerto. Feinberg's compositional output primarily comprises of works for piano, including 12 piano sonatas, 2 fantasies, 7 preludes, 2 suites, 3 piano concertos, as well as various miniatures and transcriptions. He would also author multiple arrangements of Russian symbolist poetry for piano and voice, and lastly, he composed 2 sonatas for violin and piano. It is noteworthy that Feinberg predominantly composed for his own performance. He often correlated his development as a pianist with his compositional endeavors. After graduating from the conservatory, Feinberg would return to perform for Goldenweiser, who remarked on the significant progress achieved in such short periods of time. Progress Feinberg himself attributed to his compositional work. His composition showcases virtuosic technique, broad tonal palette, and complete use of the keyboard's range. Although he attributed significant pianistic success to his composing, he struggled to see himself as a professional composer and to balance his desire to compose, perform, and teach. He regarded his creative process as distinct from that of other professional composers. Leonin Feinberg, his younger brother, would recall a conversation between Alexandrov and his brother, where Samuil Feinberg would state, "I do not consider myself a composer in the usual sense of the word. Every composer, a master of his craft, decides what he will write or what he will have to write. A specific work, a fantasy, a sonata, a concerto. He decides the style of the piece in advance, defines future theoretical settings, ponders events, selects suitable themes on the keyboard. My situation is different. I fully understand Bloch's lines. I wait for a new, hitherto unheard sound to scare away my deadly boredom. Feinberg would continue, I await my own kind of inspiration. Finally, it is imperative to highlight Feinberg's philosophies as both a pianist and composer. Feinberg recognized that the artist integrates a part of themselves and their inner world into their performances and compositions. He remarks regarding his own compositional process that, I always feel while composing that a large part of my real emotions and life are involved, and that my creative process is not remote. There can be such vivid artistic impressions reflecting what happens in life. The 12 piano sonatas, an overview. Feinberg's most prolific and innovative writing is found in his 12 piano sonatas, a genre he wrote in from the beginning of his compositional career until its end. Both his first and last works are piano sonatas, and these works allow us to trace the development of his style and artistic voice over time. The first two piano sonatas, Opuses 1 and 2, were composed in 1915, the year of Scriabin's death. These two works served as a creative catalyst for Feinberg. He composed the majority of his works for piano, including sonatas 1 through 8, in the years between 1915 and 1928. Sonata numbers 9 through 12 would be composed over a span of 23 years, 1939 through 1962, with number 12 being his final composition, written only a few months before his death. Through the examination of the 12 piano sonatas, we can divide Feinberg's compositional output into three creative periods. The first period, which includes sonatas 1 through 3, display a romantic aesthetic veiled in modernist impulses, very much in the vein of Scriabin and Schumann. Sonatas 4 through 8 are much more complex and rooted in the avant-garde style of 1920s Russia, with strong links to symbolist poetry and art. This period is also characterized by Feinberg's use of dense textures, extreme contrasts, and exploration of the entire keyboard and its tonal and coloristic possibilities. The middle period also closely relates to Scriabin's later piano sonatas in terms of sound and philosophical approach. While Scriabin attempts to express ecstasy and spiritual ideals through his music, Feinberg's voice is markedly darker and more pessimistic, conveying a more humanist and introspective inner world. The remaining sonatas, numbers 9 through 12, encompass the late period and mark a shift in Feinberg's compositional voice. He moves away from extreme complexity and towards a comparatively simple, more lyrical mode of expression. These sonatas are challenging to classify stylistically. However, they may be described as neoclassical or expressionist. Each period will be examined in greater depth through the discussions of sonatas numbers 1, 5, and 9. Unfortunately, due to time, I won't read my in-depth analysis of those three sonatas, but I will read through the description of each stylistic period, and at the end give you some things to listen for in those three sonatas, okay? Prior to examining the development of Feinberg's compositional style, it is essential to highlight the consistent elements across all three of his creative career, all three phases of his creative career. From a technical standpoint, a number of recurring idioms and compositional techniques are evident. Similar to Scriabin, Feinberg predominantly composes single movement sonatas, with only 4 of the 12, namely numbers 3, 7, 8, and 12, exhibiting multi-movement structures. He also habitually employs small motivic ideas to develop his themes, akin to the approaches of Beethoven and Haydn. Feinberg introduces these motives and subsequently transforms them throughout the course of a sonata. These themes frequently feature ascending and descending intervals of fourths, augmented fourths, and fifths, imparting a transient and ethereal quality. Furthermore, Feinberg demonstrates a consistent application of polyrhythms and polyphony. The influence of Bach and Renaissance counterpoint permeates all of his creative periods. Among his many modes of musical expression, polyrhythmic and polyphonic textures stand out as perhaps the most prominent. Not only are there stylistic consistencies in the compositional techniques Feinberg employs throughout his career, but there are also philosophical consistencies. Feinberg's younger brother, Leonin, describes him as truly romantic in his aesthetic and philosophy. Leonin writes, This complexity never becomes an end in itself. In the end, all of Feinberg's works are permeated with heightened romanticism, sometimes lyrical, more often tragic. We can also see evidence of Feinberg's romantic philosophies in his essay, The Death of Musical Form, where he discusses the issues of meaning and sound in the early 20th century, arguing that music now appears as the material of art, divorced from the original idea, which combined inseparable integrity of meaning and sound. In this same article, Feinberg expresses similar ideas to that of Liszt and the philosopher Hegel, that music is elevated by the inclusion of poetic influences. Feinberg's early period commences in 1915 with the conception of the Opus 1 and Opus 2 sonatas, and continues through 1917 with the third sonata, Opus number 3. The fourth sonata, Opus 6, is written only a year later in 1918, but already showcases a much more complex harmonic, rhythmic, and textural language. The early period is relatively small in comparison to Feinberg's middle and late periods. Some scholars contend that there are only two stylistic periods, encompassing sonatas 1 through 8 and sonatas 9 through 12. However, this paper argues that, despite the maturity and creative innovations evident in the first three sonatas, their stylistic roots are anchored in the late Romantic aesthetic, and they sound notably different from the more progressive sonatas of the middle period, warranting separate classification. To better comprehend these early sonatas and all subsequent works, it is essential to situate them in a historical context. As previously noted, Scriabin's death acted as a catalyst for Feinberg's deeper engagement in serious composition. Additionally, it is vital to consider World War I. In 1914, just 1 year prior, Feinberg was drafted into the Russian Imperial Army and dispatched to the Polish front lines. Feinberg's sensitive and nervous personality was ill-suited for warfare, a situation likely exacerbated by the horrors of war, which was then the deadliest in history. Feinberg contracted typhoid and was subsequently sent back to Moscow for recovery, leading to his release from military duties. During his convalescence, Feinberg began composing his Opus 1 and Opus 2 sonatas. The early period sonatas distinctly reflect Feinberg's affinity for composers such as Scriabin, Schumann, Beethoven, and Bach. Opuses 1 and 2 are concise compositions, characterized by straightforward single-movement sonata structures, indicative of Scriabin's influence. Conversely, the third sonata comprises 3 movements, but features unconventional sequence: a prelude, a funeral march, and a sonata. This sonata arguably stands as his most romantic work, simultaneously looking backward and forward, a quality most evident in the final movement, which resembles Chopin in its outer sections, coupled with an intensely virtuosic Beethovenian fugue in the middle, but this fugue is expressed in a more modern idiom and sound. Notably, this third sonata was not published until after Feinberg's death, and served as the foundational thematic material for his first piano concerto, Opus 20, composed in 1931. These early compositions are predominantly tonal, but employ an expansive chromatic language akin to that found in early 20th century works. The influence of Scriabin's early period is evident in Feinberg's own early compositions. Both composers utilize a variety of textures and polyrhythms. However, while Scriabin primarily conveys himself through extended and distinctive harmonies, Feinberg predominantly employs polyphony rather than harmonic complexity. By utilizing small motivic ideas, modifying them, and layering them, Feinberg develops a more horizontally oriented harmonic language in contrast to a vertical one. This layering of motives can sometimes obscure the clarity of a melody, as individual voices often represent fragments of melodic material, sustained by long pedal tones that establish a relatively simple harmonic foundation. A representative example of this approach is found in Piano Sonata No. 1. So a few things to listen to in the first piano sonata. Very standard sonata form. Primary theme, secondary theme. The primary theme is mainly written in chorale-like textures using polyphony. And the second theme resembles that of the first movement of Scriabin's second piano sonata. They're going to have very similar sounds. And of course, there's a lot of use of thematic development throughout this sonata. Moving on to the middle period. Feinberg's middle period begins in 1918 with the composition of the Fourth Sonata, which takes a much darker and experimental approach in Feinberg's sound world. This period of his musical history is one of a burgeoning avant-garde. This is evident in Feinberg's own experimentation during the time, as seen in his use of extreme complexity, virtuosity, and textural and coloristic effects. Leonin Feinberg explains that his brother is obsessed with exploring new sounds and modes of expression, especially the grotesque. As previously mentioned, Leonin would claim that, even though these compositions explore new sounds, colors, and extreme complexity, they are highly romantic in their spirit. This period is a complicated time for the composer. Even though he is arguably at a high point in his career as a pianist and composer, it is marked by a profound loneliness. This, perhaps alongside with the aftermath of World War I, creates a darker sound in his compositions, ever increasing in their cynical, tragic, and complex characters. Anatoly Alexandrov explains that Feinberg focuses on what is inexpressible. His palette includes an aesthetic theory of so-called non-existent shades, the elements of musical realization which can only be sensed by the pianist, not the listener. This philosophy is perhaps exemplified in Feinberg's middle period. Similar to Scriabin's own push towards the experimental in his later works to express a sense of ecstasy, Feinberg's middle period is seeking to subordinate the chaos of the sounds in his imagination. Before discussing the Fifth Sonata, it must be noted that the Sonata No. 6, Opus 13, composed in 1923, is his most successful work, gaining international attention and publication in the West. Also, his Sonata No. 7, Opus 21, composed in 1925, is considered to be his most complex work. His brother explains that he's pushing the outer limits of his romanticism, like Brahms pushing the outer limits of his own romanticism in his later periods. Stalin's regime would censor the middle period sonatas, No. 4 through 8, in the late 1930s, as the Cultural Revolution pushed artists to create works with broad mass appeal, labeling those who did not conform as formalist and overly Western. So for Sonata No. 5, a few things I would like to note is, it's tragic from beginning to end. There's no sense of relief. There's no positive secondary theme. It's one tragic theme and another. Lastly, he begins the sonata in B minor, and we end in E minor, which kind of gives an unresolved feeling to the entire work. And there's a fun musical Easter egg in the first couple bars. You'll hear some of Ravel's Boat on an Ocean. Moving on to his late period. Feinberg's final creative period is marked by a turn towards simpler modes of expression. Leonin Feinberg explains that, for Feinberg, after the Seventh Sonata, further complication of the formal structures of his works was hardly possible. A turning point seemed necessary. The further development of his work's style moved towards the condensation of lyrical expression. Feinberg also moves away from the more tragic nature of the middle period and presents both a triumphant quality in the 10th and 11th sonatas and a new kind of introspective lyricism in the 9th and 12th sonatas. The late period spans a much longer time than his early and middle periods. This is perhaps due to his political struggles and to the increasing demands of his teaching and performance careers. Feinberg discussed in an interview the difficulty of composing a work in small chunks over a more extended time was difficult for him. When he sat down to organize the ideas for a composition, they were already fully formed, and he needed to work only on composing when these creative impulses were fresh. Due to the nature of his creative process and other professional obligations, the time to compose became difficult to find. Nonetheless, this period produces 4 sonatas, numbers 9 through 12. Sonata No. 10, Opus 30, written between 1940 and 1945, is Feinberg's War Sonata, written shortly after he was evacuated from Moscow during World War II. The Sonata No. 11, Opus 40, written in 1952, is similar in its scope and character. These two works represent Feinberg's own push to compose pieces that are more accessible to the masses and politically safe. Yet none of the late sonatas would be published until after Feinberg died in 1962, or performed for large audiences. Perhaps this suggests that Feinberg was exploring a new compositional style simply for himself. The two sonatas that stand out the most in this period and exemplify Feinberg's movement towards the lyrical and sublime are the 9th and 12th sonatas. These two sonatas are deceptive in that they appear, at first glance, simple, but they are still quite complex. Feinberg achieves this by thinning out the textures, utilizing the dense textures found in his middle period only in key moments for dramatic effect. According to his brother, both the 9th and 12th sonatas marked the beginning of a new style for Feinberg. Unfortunately, we do not get to hear where Feinberg might have gone next compositionally, since he died only a few months after the composition of Sonata No. 12 in 1962. A few things to point out in the 9th sonata. Opening theme, much simpler, written in with two voices. Feels like a more modern version of a Bach two-part invention for a little while. As the sonata develops, he starts to bring back some of the more dense and complex textures from the middle period and a little bit of the tragic sound. But this time it is much more limited, and it doesn't obscure any melodic material. Like you'll hear in the 5th sonata, it's difficult to understand things at times. And lastly, I think that's the most important thing. So I will like to read my conclusion after I perform. So in conclusion, the piano sonatas of Samuil Feinberg are fascinating examples of works by a highly unique and individual composer. These works show a clear evolution in Feinberg's style with 3 distinctive creative periods. Even so, they also show evident consistencies from one period to the next, unique to Feinberg's highly personal voice. This paper also sought to introduce these works to a broader audience, providing background information to understand Feinberg's unique compositions better. Lastly, we explored the historical context of the creative periods, allowing for a better understanding of Feinberg's influences and creative impetus. Feinberg himself declared that his compositions were essentially autobiographical, drawing on elements of his own life to give us a glimpse into his deeper self. We began with a quote from Tatiana Nikolaeva, and it must be repeated: the 12 sonatas of Samuil Feinberg